Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our May speaker series. I'm Rich Park. I serve as a co-head of the Financial Sponsors and Strategic Solutions Group. I'm also an advisor and the former lead to the Mizuho Americas Asian Professionals Network, or what everybody knows as MAP. On behalf of MAP, I'm really excited to introduce our featured guests, Byron Pitts and Juju Chang. Both Byron and Juju are both award-winning journalists who host ABC's Nightline and have covered in depth the social movements and issues of race and identity that we are all going to discuss today. Juju is an Emmy Award winning journalist, recognized for her in depth personal narratives set against a backdrop of pressing national and international news. Recently, she reported on the rise in the crimes toward the Asian American and Pacific Islander community as anchor for the ABC News live special, Stop the Hate: The Rise in Violence Against Asian Americans, and the 2020 special, Murder in Atlanta, following the Atlanta mass shooting. Her numerous awards include multiple Emmys, Gracie's, Murrow, and Peabody Awards. Born in Seoul, South Korea, and raised in California, not North Carolina, Juju is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a founding board member of the Korean American Community Foundation. Byron is a news veteran with over 20 years of experience and multiple Emmy Awards to his name. He's known for his thoughtful storytelling, on-the-ground reporting, and in-depth interviews, and has covered national news stories and in-depth features for shows across the news division at ABC. Prior to ABC, he spent 15 years at CBS News, where he served as the chief national correspondent for the CBS Evening News and filed regularly for 60 Minutes, and won an Emmy for his coverage of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He was named the National Association of Black Journalists Journalist of the Year in 2002 and has authored 2 books, Step Out on Nothing: How Faith and Family Helped Me Conquer Life's Challenges, and Be the One: 6 True Stories of Teens Overcoming Hardship with Hope. I want to thank Juju and Byron for joining us. The topic we're covering is one of the most important to discuss at any time, but especially at this moment. Over the past year, the racism and violence directed at the Black and Asian communities in this country has really come to the forefront. And so opportunities like this one, where we could truly raise awareness and learn how to stand together and take action, are critical. Thank you again so much for joining us. And with that, I'll hand it over to John.
Great. Thank you, Rich. Really excited to do this today. It's another episode of John Buchanan interviewing the interviewers. So we're going to jump right in. Juju and Byron, again, thank you so much for being with us today. Before we go deep into the topic, I did want to give you a little time to talk about your background. I think it's important for people to know. They see you on TV every night, but just to give a little bit of background of how you got to the position you're in now. Juju, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I like to joke that I present as a successful television news anchor, but I really see the world through the eyes of a struggling young immigrant child growing up in California, who was sensitive to the kind of slights and prejudices that my father and my family were subjected to for being other. And I couldn't quite put my finger on it when I was younger. And I certainly didn't think of ourselves as financially struggling, and yet we were. And I think that is the lens through which I've been a journalist through my entire life. I think growing up in the Bay Area, my well-meaning immigrant parents sort of would have wanted me to be the next Steve Jobs, because that's where Sunnyvale is. But I kind of took the detour in college to storytelling, to journalism. And I think that has been a huge part of how I see the world, is through the travels of telling these stories of marginalized voices and of people whose stories I care about and sort of hold as a sacred trust. And I think Byron and I see the world in very similar ways. We call each other work spouses, and we are, I think, come from a similar place, right, Byron?
Absolutely. And you all need to know that the Juju is the best of our generation. I've been in this business 40 years, and there's no one in this business I respect more, care for more, know is more righteous than Juju. Yeah, I mean, we both are kids from modest means. You know, I now, in my sort of private space, I describe myself, I'm a 60-year-old man, as I'm an unapologetically Black Christian man. And so my race and my faith define who I am. I'm also a journalist, and I don't see my profession in conflict with either one of those two things that define who I am. Born and raised in Baltimore, you can see perhaps a glimpse of the Maryland state flag. I'm proud,
that, yeah.
right? Proud son of Baltimore. Raised by a single parent. My mother had my sister when she was 17. She had me before she finished high school. Like Juju's family, like many of the families represented in this call, valued hard work, valued education. I like to say I wasn't raised in Baltimore. I was raised in my mother's house, which are two very different places day to day. I became a professional journalist for a couple of reasons. I didn't learn to read until I was almost 13, spoke with a stutter until my junior year in college. And so I think on a very personal level, I understand what it means to be voiceless. And so Juju and I, every night on Nightline, in the course of our careers, get to tell the stories of the voiceless. I think we both, I know I certainly lean that direction a lot. Chose journalism in part. The church I grew up in Baltimore was fairly active in the civil rights era. The pastor of my church grew up with Dr. King, was an associate minister of his in Alabama. And the role our church played in the civil rights movement, was a big church in Baltimore that raised a lot of money for the civil rights movement. And so Daddy King, Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, Coretta Scott King performed, sang at our church. And so we would participate in rallies. It was a great place for my mom to take her kids because she didn't have to pay for a babysitter, now that she could afford one. And I remember as a child how the police would behave if there were journalists present. Excuse me, ma'am, excuse me, sir, back up. They were far more aggressive if there were no journalists there. So as a child, I saw the power of the media to keep the powerful accountable. And I think that's kind of shaped the work that I've done, and the work that Juju and I now do at Nightline. We pride ourselves both in the kind of work that we do and on our staff, that we are the show of other, that we don't take sides, but we certainly honor the truths of a variety of communities who make up our great nation.
Right. Wow, great. Thank you guys very much. I'm gonna jump right in, Juju, on anti-Asian crime and xenophobia. Obviously been highlighted in the media more recently, and of course it's not a new phenomenon, but wanted to get your perspective on why the focus now and where that's coming from.
Sure. I mean, I think that when I flew down to Atlanta and we put on a network primetime hour special, breaking news special about the murders in Atlanta, it was a galvanizing event in the Asian American community. And it really sort of heralded a moment where everyone sort of stood up against the hate. But you have to take the clock back several months to where there was a rash of crimes in the Bay Area against Asian Americans, where once again, it was sort of a catalytic event where Daniel Day Kim and others from Hollywood sort of stood up and said, enough is enough. I'm going to put money down. Let's get some action. And that is when, you know, it's sort of the previous group of people got involved. And the message then was, this is going on for a year. Let's take the clock back to the beginning of the pandemic. When COVID hit, there was a sort of weaponization of the fear and the anxiety involved around the virus by the highest levels of government, referring to it as Wuhan flu or even Kung flu, and weaponizing against the Asian American community. And that is when organizations who track extremist groups like the ADL started noticing an uptick in online hate and online conspiracies. But that is basically a triggering of something that was even there before, John, and what you said is the long history. You know, I joke to Byron all the time that, like, you know, you're a part of a marginalized community if you've had to fight for your rights in front of the US Supreme Court. And so from as far as Asian Americans are concerned, right, you take it back to the 1800s with the Chinese Exclusion Act, when Byron might know this, that Frederick Douglass spoke out on behalf of Asian Americans in that time. There's the, internment of Japanese Americans during the war, which happened even though we were fighting both the Japanese and the Germans. And I didn't see Germans round up and put in concentration camps, essentially. And then we look at more recent acts of, prejudice and unconscious bias. And we recognize that there is an othering that happens to Asian Americans that's sort of a low level, until it's triggered by an event like COVID.
And what do you think the stereotypes or falsehoods that contributed to the continued cultural acceptance of anti-Asian sentiment? Like you said, it's been going on for a while.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, it's everything from the model minority myth, which we can dig into further, but the overlay of that, right, is the crazy rich Asians, like, oh, all these crazy rich Asians. But the truth is that belies the huge income disparity, the highest disparity among any ethnic group between the richest of the rich and the least privileged. And not only is there a gap, but there's also then an invisibility. There's a part of the community that's rendered invisible because we don't see them, because we have this preconceived notion that Asians are well off, Asian Americans are well off. But poverty rates in New York City, for example, are higher among Asian Americans than African Americans. And part of that is because there's a huge undocumented group. There's a group that sort of is literally invisible. They're the ones who deliver Chinese food to you at night. They're the ones who work in the nail salons. They're the ones who walk past you and care for your loved ones or your sick ones or your children. And that is part of why othering happens. When you dig into some of these attacks, you understand that a lot of the attacks are against Asian American women. And that is another sort of myth and a stereotype that Asian American women are subjected to. Either they're seen as weak and submissive, or they're hypersexualized and fetishized. And that both ends of that dehumanizing stereotype can be harmful.
And Byron, you've extensively covered Black Lives Matter and the unrest relating to the racial inequality over the past year. What parallels are you seeing between the Asian and Black communities and what they're experiencing now?
Oh, I think there are twin stories. I was mindful of this quote I looked up the other day. It's from Coretta Scott King, where she said, "I don't believe you can stand for freedom for one group of people and deny it to others." So I think that the journey for Asian Americans is very similar to that of Black Americans, in this sense of feeling other, less than, stereotype. We saw it even in the most recent trial of Derek Chauvin, right, of the super strong Black man, right, and what that meant, and so these officers, though they had guns and tasers and nightsticks, they were the ones who were at risk because they were confronted by this very large, very strong Black man. And even in that neighborhood, that again, these officers who were there with nightsticks, tasers, guns, and police training felt threatened by a group of a 9-year-old, a 14-year-old girl, and an amateur MMA fighter, and a white woman, and an older Black man. So I think that there is a similar narrative, like Juju was saying. I think certainly this is true in Black America, that this racial awakening that we're in as a nation, supposedly, didn't just occur overnight. That I think for many people, George Floyd was the straw this time. It's been compared oftentimes to the death of Emmett Till, the Black boy who was lynched, beaten to death in Mississippi, a child from Chicago who had the audacity to whistle at a white woman in the Deep South. And that sparked a moment, right? Emmett Till wasn't the first Black male to die in the hands of a white mob, but something about that the imagery of that moment spoke to the nation in the same way in which the imagery of George Floyd, this man on the ground, a knee to his neck, for what to any reasonable person seemed like an excessive amount of time, led to his death, I think sparked something that had been building in the nation, just like the death of Emmett Till sparked something that had been building in the nation for a very long time.
Thank you. And Byron, can you talk a little bit about intersectionality and what it means and how it can be used to understand identity and inequality?
Sure, it's challenging. Juju and I, as members of the ABC News family, I'm sure like every corporation, is in the midst of how does corporate America respond to this moment. And I'm on a council at Walt Disney that looks at how do we impact the culture. And one of the things that we're discovering now, and Juju and I talk about this, is that I'll use Walt Disney as the example, that they decided there was there are all these communities in need, but statistically, the community in greatest need in the corporate space that is Walt Disney were the African American employees. And so there's been a lot of effort to address that corporate emergency, if you will. But now there's sort of this recognition that what's happening for other groups at Walt Disney and ABC News, that there's a sense about what about us? What about now? And so work that Juju and I are engaged in particular with the Black, Asian, and Latino population at ABC News is how do we come together, that as opposed to historically these groups fighting over the broken chair at the side of the room, how do we create a space, how do we create a corporate culture in which all are welcome? Because the reality is, while today we're talking about Asians and Blacks, tomorrow tomorrow or yesterday it was Latinos, it was Muslims. It's always other. And so I think that there's a level of sophistication, I believe, at ABC News now that we need to talk about everybody at the same time.
And I'm going to come back to that one. That's the fascinating part of this. Juju, what have you observed as the biggest cultural challenges that Asians in particular have in addressing discrimination and racism?
I interviewed the Hollywood star Olivia Munn, and she said to me something that kind of broke my heart. She said, my mother is a Vietnam War refugee. She spoke with a heavy accent. She raised me essentially as a single mother. And I saw and observed something that I saw and observed with my father growing up is that they were treated like second-class citizens. And Olivia said, my mother accepted that. They saw it as something like the Uncle Sam tax, that's what you pay for when you come and enjoy the rights and privileges of being an American. And what the younger generation now is saying is that we need to overcome some of these cultural challenges, as you say. So the cultural challenges of, just keep your head down, don't draw attention to yourself, don't create any problems, don't create any waves. That kind of cultural tendency is being overturned right now by young activists who say, oh no, we need to fight for our rights. We need to raise our voices. We need to take to the streets. We need to do the things that we need to do to get some of these hate crimes reported and tallied. So for example, if you are an elder American, as many of these victims are, and when you mentioned intersectionality, there's an intersectionality of the victims of these crimes and poverty and lack of access to opportunity. So a lot of these elder Americans who live in Chinatown or in urban settings, they might have a language barrier that makes them shy about coming forward. They might have an immigration status that make them shy about coming forward. They might not understand the words that were hurled at them in the midst of an attack. So how did they go to police and say, they said something, but I don't quite know? How did they get witnesses to report? So it's the younger generation who's sort of trying to flip that, cultural tendency and literally march their elders, the ones that they were raised to revere and respect and take care of, to the halls of justice so that they can have what's due. And I think that is creating a little bit of a snowball effect, that once one person comes forward and recognizes that they can be heard, that others might follow suit. And I think that is, some of the biggest cultural challenges that we're facing.
Yeah. And are you guys hopeful? I mean, obviously it's been a year like no other, but there, you can look at it two ways. There are positive things happening. The rock has been turned over. We're seeing, and in some ways addressing this. So do you feel hopeful?
Byron, you want to take that?
Yeah, certainly I think for Juju and I that our lives dictate that we be hopeful, right? That we are both the products of the hopes and dreams of our parents and to live lives that they could barely dream of. So certainly that leaves one hopeful. But I'm thinking, my youngest daughter is 28. And I remember when I was 17, coming out of high school, went to a predominantly white high school, I was incredibly optimistic about the future of America and what was possible in race relations. And the fact that, 3 of my closest friends were young white men. And we remain close friends to this point. But then that optimism waned some in college, waned again in my professional life, when I realized I was sophisticated enough to know that there's certain things that happened to me because I'm Black. Some of those things were advantageous, but the vast majority of those experiences were negative. And so I wasn't as optimistic. Then I got married and had family. And my daughters, who for the most part grew up in Montclair, New Jersey, for those of you familiar, incredibly diverse town, economically, racially, culturally, religion. And I thought, wow, okay, we're better. And then, how my daughters saw the world was very different than how I saw the world. And then last summer, my beautiful, who Juju knows well, at that time, 27-year-old college-educated daughter, starring in a Broadway play, living her best life, a sweet soul, was participating in a Black Lives Matter march in New York City. And a white police officer knocked her to the ground. 3 white police officers followed her home in a very menacing way for blocks away from the protests. And it wasn't until she got me on FaceTime on her phone. And Juju knows me well, and I don't play this card often, but I wanted these 3 officers hard, saying who I was, what I did for a living, and what I would do to them professionally if they harm my child. And so, so my optimism is tempered from the 17-year-old boy to the 60-year-old man. My daughter's optimism, though she is still optimistic, is tempered some by that experience that she had in others. So I think there is no alternative, right, to optimism and to hope and to working hard. But do I think that we are near the end? No, I don't believe that at all.
Yeah. Totally. Juju.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank you for sharing that personal story, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
My eyes are misty just thinking about it, because his daughter is an unbelievable spirit, and to have her spirit be crushed even for that day is heartbreaking to me. And I've heard that story before, and it's still so moving. I do think that I'm optimistic. I do think that what you said, John, is very true, that Iraq has been overturned, that we can't unsee what we've seen. And I think that what we've experienced in the last year is a confluence of events that we cannot, this generation growing up, this is a formative year for them. And I think that it's gonna have a lasting impact. And I think it's everything from Byron and my reporting with Nightline of the racial inequities of COVID, right? That's where, to me, if you were paying attention, that's where it started. When people were getting infected and hospitalized and dying at dramatically different rates based on the color of their skin is something that you have to acknowledge as a human and understand the underlying conditions that lead to that, right? And then move to George Floyd. And what gives me hope about, and the fact that we can now say that Derek Chauvin is a convicted murderer, to me is a note of progress. And the fact that the people who took to the streets, and I know because as a journalist, I covered the protests, looked like America. They weren't just people of color on the streets. There were mothers and children and grandparents and neighbors and, LGBTQ folks. And that to me signaled something larger. And I think that it encompassed and sparked a real activism. Again, I've interviewed people who said, as Asian Americans, I'd never seen that many Asian Americans take to the streets calling for racial equity. And that in the undertone of all of this was the anti-Asian hate that we were feeling and bubbling until it exploded, at which point the young activists were saying, now we have an understanding of what it takes. Now we've seen these things, and we're going to try to lock arms with our Black and brown brothers and sisters and move forward towards progress. And frankly, our white allies. I like to say that the feminist movement's biggest boosts have been from the thanks to men. And I think that the struggle for people of color, that our biggest allies are going to be our white allies, and that this is a moment of inclusion. This is a moment for the vast majority of Americans to stand up against hate, to stand up against oppression and say, I know what's fair and this is not fair. So let's move forward together as like-minded people who are righteous.
You know, and to Juju's point, that's probably the one thing I'm most optimistic about, this sense of allyship, right? I think for so long, too long in our nation, when the racial conversation has been on one side, you have people of color who are victims, on the other side, you have white people who are perpetrators. What success can you find in that conversation, right? Where you're the problem and the other side says, no, you're the problem. Well, now I feel like we're in this moment, to Juju's point, that everybody recognize that this country that we all love can do better, should do better, and damn it, let's finally do better, right? I mean, I think about, you know, it was Dr. King who said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And that bending takes time. Emmett Till happened in 1955. The Voting Rights Act didn't pass until 1965. You know, we now have this George Floyd bill that passed the House, now it's in the Senate. I don't know of too many people who are that optimistic that Joe Biden is going to sign it into law anytime soon. So yeah, I think that is the new dynamic in this conversation, that now our white brothers and sisters feel like brothers and sisters in this discussion, that no one is just sort of pointing the finger at individuals, but pointing fingers at systems and cultures that all of us can play an equal role in breaking and moving to a better place.
Absolutely. And I think Dr. King also said something along the lines of, you know, the biggest problem is the silence of good people. And so we're starting to see that change, hopefully. You know, the Black Lives Matter and the movement last summer was intergenerational, multiracial. Are we seeing the same thing with the Asian community and what they're going through now? And is there things we can be doing to promote that?
I mean, I think so. I've taken part in a number of conversations. You know, we're in the age of the webinar, but I did a webinar recently with the head of the NAACP, the head of the ADL, the Jewish group that tracks extremism, and the head of the C100, a Chinese nonprofit, and talking about ways forward to unite around issues like voting rights, because the Asian American community, for example, for decades, the Asian American Legal Defense Fund has worked towards getting bilingual ballot access and access to voting registration in places all over the country. And if you look at the Georgia Senate race, you know, the margin of victory was, you know, within the Asian American community. And there was a great get out the vote effort on that part. And so there are margins around the country. The biggest problem, however, though, is that we're not a monolithic community, right? Asian Americans encompass more than 50 countries, dozens of languages, dozens of cultures, and we span the political spectrum. So when I say that Atlanta was a galvanizing moment, it was in the sense that we all stood up and noticed, wait, we have more in common than we have differences. And that was like an interesting wake-up call, I think.
And Byron, what you guys have reported obviously extensively on the pandemic, but I wanted to ask your thoughts on the pandemic kind of intersecting with the Black Lives Movement and the murder of George Floyd. And do you think it would have been so historic last summer if we hadn't been in the middle of a pandemic?
Oh, I think it was vital. I mean, I think all, you know, like Juju and I, also in our business, we cover a lot of plane crashes, right? And what you often learn with a plane crash is rarely is there one thing that brings a plane down, but there's a series of things that occur that all happen in a sequence that brings it down. And I think that's what occurred. I mean, because of COVID, more and more Americans were at home. People like we've seen our ratings go up during COVID because more people were more engaged in the news. So I think that's different. I think this age we live in, because of technology and social media, our colleague Steve Osunsami made this great point, simple point on TV the other day, that the only difference between George Floyd and other moments is that a child had a cell phone to document it. And so I think because of technology, because of cell phones, because more and more people are leaning into the internet and gathering that information that way. But I think all those things lined up. The fact that, how George Floyd died, because, there was a video a year or two prior of a Black man running away from a police officer and was shot in the back and killed, and that sort of wasn't enough. We had the young man killed in Georgia. He was jogging, and these two men shot him down in the street like a dog. That wasn't enough. But there was something about the particulars of how George Floyd died. I think that the fact that social media could capture it and it spread so quickly around the country, around the world. And then I think the pandemic had all of us, as the kids would say, had all of us in our feelings, right? I mean, families were worried about how do we keep each other safe, and life for many of us became simpler, right? It wasn't about the big fancy vacation, or it was about how do I keep myself and my kids safe. And so life mattered in a precious way because of COVID, because we weren't distracted by the niceties of life. And so in this moment in which life mattered and we were concerned about our parents and our grandparents and our colleagues who got sick, you see this Black man die on television, on camera. So I think all those things were required for us to have this moment.
Thank you. Juju, I want to come back to the model minority myth. It's a mouthful too, but to give you a chance to explain that a little bit more. That was not necessarily a concept I was familiar with prior to talking to you last week, but if you could talk about it a little more.
Sure. I mean, there is this idea born out of sort of 1.5 generation Korean Americans, Asian Americans writ large, that, Asian Americans were all going to the Ivy League schools, and they were all, getting into the upper echelons of banks like Mizuho. They were all like, just killing it out there, killing it. But the truth is, that obscures so much. And it's the kind of stereotype where people are like, what's wrong with that stereotype? They're saying you're rich and successful. What's wrong with that? And the truth is, it puts undue pressure on Asian American young people. I've talked to so many who say, I can't live up to this, and I want to be a chef. I talked to David Chang of Momofuku, who said, I felt worthless because I couldn't get good grades, and my parents were like, what is wrong with you? And I just wanted to drive my motorcycle fast and cook good food, and so there's that part of it. But then there's also, again, this rendering invisible so many who are in need, who don't fit under that stereotype. It's the same kind of and again, it's the kind of stereotype that people don't necessarily want to disavow, because you're thinking, well, what's the harm? And haha, yeah, we're all successful. And the truth is, that stereotype, kind of like the way Asian American women are stereotyped, really can do harm. And when we look into the statistics collected last year by an organization called Stop AAPI Hate, they found between March and December of last year, something in the order of 3,000, 4,000, 3,800, almost 4,000 bias crimes against Asian Americans were reported. And by a margin of 2 to 1, it was Asian women who were reporting them, not men. And again, it speaks to, I've had people say, well, what's wrong with somebody saying they're attracted to you because you're Asian, you're like a sex something. And you're like, well, first of all, it's totally dehumanizing and insulting. Second of all, we've had activists in the Asian American community like Amanda Nguyen who relate it to rape culture. And then it just, any stereotype that dehumanizes you really sort of can be incredibly painful. And a lot of that was awakened, frankly, in Atlanta, when I flew down and interviewed the son of one of the women who was killed. And mind you, I had interviewed the daughter of another woman who was killed, a Chinese American who had worked her way, 12-hour days, 6 days a week in serial entrepreneurship, getting her massage license, opening a spa, making sure that there were signs on the wall that said no sex, calling the police anytime somebody engaged in, asking for a sex act. Completely hands were clean. And yet when the shooter went into these spas, he associated any Asian woman in these spas as a sex worker. And yet at the same time, the other young man that I spoke to, his name was Randall Park, his mother died as well. And he said when he was young, she had told him that she worked in a makeup parlor. And only later as an adolescent did he ever go to her spa. And he said it was shady. And I confronted her about it. And this was like a heart-stopping conversation with the cameras rolling. And he said, but I confronted her about it because I didn't want her to lie to me. And I wanted her to stay safe. And I said, I will never shame you for this, because this is part of the sacrifice that you've made as a single mom, some of the decisions that you've made, hard choices, which is like incredibly mature for a 20-year-old man. But then he goes on GoFundMe and says, here's my story. I don't believe what the sheriff said, who came out and said, this isn't about race, this is about sex. And the Asian American community was like, these two issues are very intertwined. And he went on GoFundMe and said, maybe you could help me make rent, because now my little brother and I don't want to move out of this little condo that my mother was raising us in. And maybe you could help me with some funeral expenses. And within 3 days, he had raised nearly $3 million from 70,000 strangers, many of whom were not even Asian, but many of whom were Asian immigrants who said, we see you, we see your mother, we understand, and we give you our sympathy and our grace. And I was blown away by the response. And that's what I mean. It was this a moment where people stood up with such fury and said, whether you were or not, it doesn't matter. The point is that the dehumanization of these victims was really painful in this moment of crisis.
Yeah, absolutely.
See why I love her? See why she's so awesome?
Yeah. That was great. I'm trying to, I want to talk a little bit about the media and your role in bringing awareness to these issues, and you guys are at it every day. How has it changed over the past year in terms of how you're treating race issues and bringing them to your show, Byron?
Well, I think, for the record, and Juju and I have talked about this, I think just as an industry, we've been awful. Let me rephrase that. I think we suck historically when it comes. I mean, your industry is finance, and I'm sure you guys have your own issues in that regard. And we're certainly doing the media. I mean, I think we're guilty. I'm sure in your company, in your industry, there are no lazy people, no one seeking shortcuts. But our business is littered with those kinds of people who are lazy and who seek shortcuts. And just in how we cover communities. Now, I worked in Boston, a large local TV market, and then through the mid 1980s. And one day they asked me, because there was a racial reckoning moment in Boston, Charles Stewart murder case. You should look it up. It's a case where a white man said a black guy shot his wife. Not an original concept, but it was big news there. Anyway, and so I looked at the local broadcast in Boston for the month of November, which in the TV business, November and May are big months because those are ratings months, right? And ways in which stations can then charge their fees for advertising. Anyway, so I looked at things. So for instance, in this 1 month in Boston, a major market, sophisticated market, at one of the premier local TV stations in the country, WCBB, which happens to be an ABC affiliate. And so for the month of November, when like everybody is at their best, working their hardest to produce their best work, white men were allowed to be like the Army's motto, be all that you can be. You saw them in every aspect of life. Black experts, but for instance, when the stories relate to finance, never once was a woman interviewed, never once was a person of color, Black, Asian, Latino interviewed about money. If even in like weather, when they would take the beautiful weather shot, like every TV station in the country does that. Like today it's snowing in Minnesota and there's some beautiful snowing shot. Not once did any of those images take place in a minority community? Something else I noticed in that month of November in Boston, this large, sophisticated market. Not a single time in the month of November was a Black person, a Latino person, or an Asian person interviewed inside their home. Every interview took place on the street, which, if you were land on Earth from Mars, you would think, well, I guess only white people own homes. And one of the 3 other examples, a bigger shock. So that particularly, I remember in 1989, they had a record snowfall in Boston that year, like 91 inches or something crazy like that. But here is the bigger news. That awful snowstorm that shut down Boston didn't impact Black people, didn't impact Asian people, didn't impact Latino people, because no story included anyone from that group. In sports, even in sports, where you figure it's just about ability and merit, and you might see more people of color in that space. Nope. There's a segment there in local TV station. It's called the Unsung Hero. Some high school kid, and so the general consensus, the general approach was a kid who's beaten the odds, may not be the best player on the team, but is, awesome. That was a narrative if you were white. If you were Black, if you were Asian, if you were Latino, there was some pathology about your life, something tragic in your life that was being highlighted. And so that was an example of how I think the media so often, intentionally or unintentionally, contributes to this problem, this narrative of how people are seeing this whole thing about Black on Black crime. According to the FBI, most crimes are committed by people who live near their person, related to their person. So there is no such thing as Black on Black crime, just as there is no such phrase as white on white crime. Last thing I'll say. And I worked in Atlanta in local television. I would say 3 things would get you on TV every single day in Atlanta: weather, traffic, or white women. If anything happened to a white woman, and a wealthy white woman in particular, that was a major news story. So TV stations every single day make determinations about what they're going to cover by race, by class, by gender. I think that's gotten better, but it's still a challenge in our business.
Juju, do you want to comment on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think Byron is recognizing, pointing out the issue, the problem. And I would say that we have been working, perhaps not 100% successfully, towards rectifying that problem. So when we look for experts, we have a multicultural handbook of experts that we're trying to go to now, so that when it comes to finance, when you come see a doctor, you see Dr. Jha on our air, who's from India. When you go to a lawyer, you can see an African American woman. When you see, just to sort of normalize that role that people of color play, but also in the characters that we profile. So for example, there was a flood, right, Byron, in Texas. And normally we pick the white family or the white hero, the white firefighter who comes in and saves the day. And in this particular case, we found an African-American woman who in her own spare time got her little boat and was out rescuing people. And so we decided to just focus in on her. And it wasn't like, oh, see this Black woman saving lives. We just said, look at this wonderful person saving lives. And I remember interviewing Shonda Rhimes at the height of her Grey's Anatomy, How to Do a Murder, 15 franchises success at ABC television. And she said, this has got to be not about, stereotyping people. So Grey's Anatomy is not a show about Black doctors. Grey's Anatomy is a show about great doctors who happen to be Black. And, that is what the successful archetype of storytelling is. And we did a little piece right now about Minari, which is the Korean American story of a family. And when I interviewed the director, he said, I want this. Yeah, it's a brilliant movie, a masterful piece of cinema. But when I asked the director about it, he's like, I didn't want it to be an Asian American story. I want it to be a great story about a family who happens to be Asian American. And that is when you've crossed the Rubicon, and hopefully that's the goal.
Yeah.
It's something, John, that Juju said earlier that I just love when she said this notion of we see you. And that's certainly a mantra of how we approach stories at Nightline. Not that we don't see, like we still do stories involving white people. It isn't about excluding anybody. It's like we see you, we see everybody. And so we want to respect everybody's truth. And so I think that apply. And one of the cultural changes that's going on at Walt Disney is this notion of we're now going to see everybody. Someone in your industry, a dear friend, many of your colleagues know Melody Hobson, who's
she spoke to Mizuho recently. We had her
that's
on.
great. She's fantastic.
Yeah. So because she talks about being color brave versus color blind, and there's a difference. One requires one to be intentional, and to see people. The other allows you to kind of keep your eyes closed.
And I do think that there are industries, sorry, John, like in the NFL, the Rooney Rule has become part and parcel. Anytime you sort of put blinders on in the inclusion process, literally, if you put people trying out for the orchestra behind a curtain, more women are promoted. In sciences, if you block out gender, more women get, promoted in the sciences. So the more we can be sort of, take the Rooney Rule and say, let's at least interview, 3 or 4 people. In addition, just open the pool. And that like in science projects, they said, if you allow for self-nomination, that allows more, diverse applicants. So there are many ways that you can break down the structural, narrowness of the institutions that we engage in.
And John, sorry, you guys both.
No, go for it. Go for it. Yeah,
I was thinking about something that Bob Chapek, who's the CEO of Walt Disney, said when he created these 2 councils at Walt Disney, and about the importance of in these conversations in leadership. Like, what does leadership say in changing culture? And so, in this council group that I'm a part of with Bob and like maybe 18 people across Disney, he said, "Look, here's the reality. Last quarter, COVID, Walt Disney lost $5 billion with the B. Like, that's real, right? We're a business, and we got to figure that part out. But the conversation we're having right now about diversity and inclusion, in my mind, as a CEO of Walt Disney Company, that matters just as much. I can't get one right and fail the other. So we're going to do both things well." And he also said at the end of his opening remarks, he says, "Look, in our culture at Walt Disney, we measure things that count. If it counts, we measure it. If we measure it, it counts." And so he was very clear about, like, let's go across the organization and look at numbers and how do we impact numbers. And part of our cultural changes, we're not just going to talk about it, we're going to measure it, and then we're going to be able to document that we can do better. Because I feel like that he said that we've reached a part as a nation that there's no one can say with a straight face, we couldn't find them. Any category of human being of excellence exists in America today. Anyway, so.
Fantastic. I just one more question about this, because this is fascinating. This concept of intentionality versus. Is there somebody in Nightline that's saying, hold on a second, let's widen the scope there, or is that coming organically because you have more diverse people working there and thinking about that, or maybe it's a combination of both?
It's absolutely a combination of both, but it's far more so that we have a diverse perspective among our team. And I think that we have, therefore, because when you're not intentional, your unconscious biases take over. And we all know, study after study shows that we all have unconscious bias. And so to try to act intentionally is the only way to work at it. And what I have found is that this diverse perspective doesn't mean that you have to be a person of color or a part of the queer community, because thinking diversely is contagious. And I find that some of my white colleagues who worked on AAPI hate stories with me are now the most vocal folks in this realm, right? Because now they know. And once you know, you can't unknow. And that makes, and I think our folks feel the same way about, the aftermath of George Floyd and police use of force and et cetera. Like, we're very well versed in all of these categories. And I think that we have done, I have a show on Thursday night about Walter Wallace Jr., who was shot and killed during a mental health crisis in Philadelphia. And you would think that the folks on our team have master's degrees in the use of force among police officers, because we've delved that deeply into it. Yeah. And so we can't help but think diversely.
Great. Thank you. I could do this for a long time, but one last question or I will point out or put out there is New York City, and so we're in the process of thinking about, and we're coming back to work in September. We're going to open our offices, but we will be opening them this summer, and hopefully having folks come back. What are you seeing in the city? I am coming into the office, and yeah, things are picking up. The subway's full, et cetera, et cetera. What are you guys thinking and seeing there?
I love this image of you on the subway, John. That fills my heart. Byron, you go.
Yeah, I think, we had this very same conversation on Nightline on Monday in our staff meeting, 11 o'clock Zoom staff meeting. I feel like, it both leaves me hopeful and it frightens me in some ways that we are getting back to normal. You're seeing more and more activity in the city. There are too many storefronts that are closed that may not reopen, but it feels like we're moving closer. I like just walking through Manhattan today, lots of people on the street, and that I'm hopeful about that. But then what concerns me is that we'll drift back into bad habits. I think about being in New York on 9/11 and what a remarkable place New York felt like on September 12th and 13th and 14th, and for those first few weeks and months. And then can't say when it happened, but it went back to what it was. So I'm hopeful about how New York is reopening. History tells me that all of us need to sort of remain vigilant.
I agree. I'll end on an up note, although I will warn that the folks that we've talked to, we've covered mass shooting after mass shooting after mass shooting after mass shooting for the last 6 or 7 weeks now. And experts have told us that, we should expect a long, hot summer, because there's been a lot of disordered thinking and behavior trapped behind pandemic walls, and that acting out will then spill out on the streets. That said, I've been in New York the entire time, and I think that there is this renewed spirit, a renewed energy. Restaurants are reporting that people are coming back in droves. I think that the pulse of this city is coming back. We were on silent mode for a while, but there's definitely an enthusiasm in the air, and I think there is a New York strong can-do spirit that permeates.
Hey, John, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
I always like that we have these kind of conversations. Quick exchange. How old are you?
Me, I'm 56.
Okay, so if I have 2 minutes, exchange between us. Okay, you're 56, I'm 60. What did your parents do for a living?
My father was a Presbyterian minister, and my mother is a homemaker.
Okay, my mother became a social worker, seamstress a lot of her years. She went to college. My father was a meat cutter. What did your grandparents do?
They worked on the railroad.
Okay, so blue collar people work with their hands. My grandparents were farmers. What did your great grandparents do?
They were all railroad people way back in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Yeah.
So blue collar, hard scrabble. So part of the legacy of that is the value of hard work. Thank God you never had to do it, hopefully, but you recognize it's in your DNA. I
would argue he's working really hard at Mizuho, Byron. Just
absolutely.
He ain't breaking rock there.
My hands aren't dirty though.
Absolutely, but it is that Pennsylvania work ethic that you bring to this job you have now. My great grandmother was born a slave. A dog, a shovel, a rake, a cow, a piece of equipment. And so what your earlier question about, am I hopeful? That narrative, your journey, my journey, Juju's journey, all of our journey gives me hope that if my great grandmother, who was a piece of equipment, was less than human, that we can now fast forward in this fancy world we live in and technology, and that we can be friends, we can have these conversations, that it reminds me, that story, your story, John, my story, Juju's story, Rich Park's story, reminds me of what's so magical about America, right? That there are many great places in the world, but one of those places is here. And that if it can happen any place, it can happen here.
Great. Thank you so much.
So John, before you go, I just want to say thank you and a shout out to my little brother, Rich Park, brother from another mother. And because if you have him in your leadership ranks here at Mizuho, you are in good hands. Thank you.
Amen. Amen. I second that. Rich is a friend. We love him. He's family. When he first asked us about this, we said yes immediately before we knew what a great company you all have, because we know he is a great man, a great leader. And so with people like Rich on your team, we know that the best days are ahead for your company. So thank you.
And thanks, John, for the fabulous questions.
Great. Thank you, guys. Good night. Thank you.